Paris, October 1935. A young woman stands at the rear entrance of a cabaret on the Rue Pierre Charon, waiting to be told what to do next. She has just performed for the first time on a proper stage. Not a street corner, not a courtyard, not the narrow strip of pavement outside a Belleville cafe where strangers tossed coins without stopping. A real stage, with lights and a crowd that had gone quiet in a way she had not expected. They had applauded. Some had wept, which she had seen before on the street, and which still unsettled her slightly. Louis Leplay, who had brought her here and dressed her in a plain black dress because he thought simplicity would suit her, was somewhere inside speaking to people whose names she did not yet know. She was 20 years old. She had no fixed address. The dress was borrowed. What happened in the next few months, the recordings, the radio appearances, the slow construction of a public name, would look, from a distance, like the beginning of something. And it was. But the terms of that beginning were already set in ways she could not fully read, and would not fully read for years. She had been discovered. She had also been taken up, which is a different thing, though it rarely announces itself as such at the time. This is the story of what followed. Not the songs exactly, like Oberpike and Hatut, though the songs are never entirely absent. The story of the life that produced them, and the life that the songs in turn made harder to see clearly. The birth certificate says December 19th, 1915. The address given is 72 Rue de Belleville, in the 20th arrondissement of Paris, a working-class district of steep streets, outdoor markets, and apartment buildings where several families shared a single water source on each floor. The story that would later circulate, and that Piaf herself repeated in interviews, was that she was born on the pavement outside that building, because her father was away and her mother could not make it inside in time. Biographers have since cast doubt on this. The pavement birth is almost certainly invented, or at minimum embellished, but the fact that she told it repeatedly, and that she told it without apparent embarrassment, as though being born in the street was not a misfortune, but a kind of credential. That detail is worth holding on to. Her mother, Annetta Maillard, was 19 years old and sang in the street for money, which is how she had met Louis Gassion, Edith's father, who was a street acrobat. They were not married. They were barely a couple in any stable sense. Annetta had Breton and Moroccan Kabyle ancestry, a fact that would occasionally surface in later profiles of Piaf with a kind of pointed curiosity that said more about the writers than about her. What mattered in practical terms was that Annetta was young, poor, musically gifted in a raw and untrained way, and entirely unprepared for a child. She left within the year. There is no dramatic account of the departure, no argument, no scene, no letter. She simply was no longer present. Edith was left with her paternal grandmother in Paris briefly, then with Louis's mother, who ran a licensed brothel in Bernay, Normandy. Louis had gone back to his itinerant work, performing in small towns and military barracks, sending money when he could, which was not often. The brothel in Bernay is where Edith spent what would have been, in other circumstances, her early childhood years. Roughly from age 2 or 3 until around 6, the women who worked there fed her, clothed her, and apparently treated her with a warmth that the rest of her early life had not provided. She would later speak of this period without shame and without sentimentality. It was where she lived. The women were kind. That seemed to her to be the relevant information. At some point during these years, the exact timing is uncertain, Edith developed keratitis, a serious inflammation of the cornea, likely caused by an infection that went untreated long enough to threaten her sight permanently. For a period of several months, she was effectively blind. The grandmother, according to accounts Edith gave later, organized a pilgrimage to Lisieux, to the shrine of Sainte Thérèse, as an act of religious appeal. Whether it was the pilgrimage or the natural course of the infection resolving, the blindness lifted. Edith could see again. She would attribute this recovery to Sainte Thérèse for the rest of her life. She kept images of the saint in her dressing rooms. She spoke of the recovery not as a medical event, but as an intervention. For a woman who would later be accused by critics and colleagues of magical thinking, believing in luck, in signs, in the devotion of certain objects, this was the foundational experience. She had been in darkness. Something had returned her to the light. The explanation she was given and accepted was supernatural. Nothing in the rest of her life would seriously challenge that framework. Louis Gassion reclaimed her around 1922, when she was 6 or 7. He had decided, or perhaps simply happened upon the decision, that she was old enough to be useful. He incorporated her into his street act. She would sing while he performed his acrobatic routines, and the combination drew larger crowds than either could alone. She had, even then, a voice that stopped people. Not because it was technically accomplished. She had no training, no instruction, nothing but the raw material and years of hearing her mother's street songs repeated in her memory. But it had a quality that is difficult to name precisely, and that contemporaries would spend decades attempting to describe. A directness, a lack of self-protection, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere further back than the throat. They traveled together for several years through the suburbs and small towns around Paris. The life was physically demanding and financially precarious. They ate when the crowds were generous. They did not eat when the crowds were not. Louis was not cruel, by the accounts available, but he was not attentive in the way a parent of a young child requires attentiveness. He was a man with a skill and a circuit, and a daughter who had turned out to be an asset. The relationship operated on those terms. By her early teens, Edith was performing alone. She had moved away from her father, not through any formal break, but through the gradual drift that happens when two people are both just surviving, and survival begins to pull in different directions. She was on the streets of Belleville and Ménilmontant, singing for coins, sometimes with a friend named Simone Berthaud, known as Momone, who would remain a figure in her life for decades, and who would later write a memoir about her that Piaf's estate would contest as unreliable. Momone's reliability as a source is indeed questionable, but she was there in those years, which most people who would later claim to know Piaf were not. The Belleville of the early 1930s was a particular kind of place. It was not picturesque poverty, not the romantic destitution that Paris had learned to package for tourists and novelists. It was crowded, loud, politically volatile, and full of people who had come from elsewhere and had not been absorbed into anything more stable. Edith moved through it with the ease of someone who had never known anything else, which is not the same as being comfortable. It is simply the absence of contrast. She was 15, 16, 17. She sang on street corners and in courtyards, and occasionally in the small cafes that would let her perform for a share of whatever she could pull from the customers. She had by this point a daughter of her own, Marcel, born in 1933 when Edith was 17, to a young man named Louis Dupont, whom she had been living with briefly. Marcel died of meningitis in 1935 at 2 years old. Edith was not with her when she died. She was working. There is a particular quality to the silence that surrounds Edith's early childhood in Bernay. Not the silence of things unknown, but of things that were known and then carefully set aside. When Piaf spoke publicly about her grandmother's house, she described it with a flatness that was neither fond nor bitter. It was where she had lived. The women had been good to her. She moved on quickly in conversation, the way people do when a subject has been processed privately to the point where public discussion of it feels redundant. What can be reconstructed is this: Louis Gassion, having no stable home and no reliable income, and a child he could not adequately care for, brought Edith to his mother, Mamantine, who ran the establishment in Bernay with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone managing a small business, which is precisely what it was. Licensed brothels in early 20th century France operated under municipal regulation. They were visible, taxed, and embedded in the ordinary commercial life of their neighborhoods in ways that later historical sanitizing tends to obscure. Mamantina was not a figure from the shadows. She was a local proprietress. The women who worked in the house fed Edith at their table. They dressed her when her clothes wore out. They appear in the fragments of testimony available to have found her presence both amusing and softening. A child in that environment introduced a kind of texture that the work itself did not provide. One account, relayed through Simone Berthaud's contested memoir, describes the women bringing Edith small gifts: a ribbon, a sweet, a pair of shoes that had been set aside from somewhere. These details may or may not be precise, but the general contour, that Edith was cared for in that house, by women whose professional lives place them at the lowest edge of social respectability, appears consistently enough across sources to be treated as substantially true. What this period installed in her is harder to trace directly, and the script's obligation is to stay close to what can be demonstrated rather than inferred. But certain patterns in her later life are difficult to discuss without acknowledging this formation. Her complete absence of class anxiety around women who worked in sex trades, at a time when middle-class France treated such women as categorically separate from respectable society, was visible throughout her adult life. She did not perform discomfort around people whose lives others found disreputable. She had been raised, in part, by them. They had been kind. The social architecture that required their exclusion was not something she had been taught to maintain. The keratitis arrived during these years, its onset gradual enough that it may not have been immediately recognized for what it was. Infections of the eye in young children in an era before antibiotics were available followed their own logic, entirely independent of whatever care surrounded them. The cornea inflamed, vision clouded. By the time the severity was apparent, the damage was already significant. Edith could perceive light and shadow, but not shape. She could not recognize faces. Mamantine's response, the pilgrimage to Lisieux, was entirely consistent with the religious culture of rural Normandy in the early 1920s. Thérèse of Lisieux had died in 1897 and been beatified in 1923. Her cult was already substantial in the region well before the official recognition. Pilgrims traveled to the Carmelite convent, where she had lived and died in considerable numbers, bringing petitions and returning with accounts of intercessions received. Mamontine organized the trip with the seriousness of someone who believed in the mechanism being invoked. The infection resolved. Whether it had run its natural course or was already resolving before the pilgrimage, the sequence of events, prayer, journey, recovery, was recorded in Edith's understanding in a specific order. Cause preceded effect. The saint had acted. This was not naive credulity on the part of a small child. It was the explanation provided by the adults around her in a cultural context that treated such explanations as ordinary rather than extraordinary. What is significant is not that she believed it, but that she never stopped believing it, and that the belief produced in her a relationship with suffering that would shape every major decision of her adult life. Suffering in this framework was not random. It had direction. It could be addressed through the right kind of appeal, and it sometimes resolved. Louis came back for her around 1922. The departure from Bernay was not, by any account, difficult for him to execute. He needed a performing partner. She could sing. The calculation was not complicated, and there is no evidence that he experienced it as anything other than practical. Edith was handed from one set of circumstances to another without being consulted, which was entirely normal for a child of her age and class in that era, and which is worth noting precisely because it was normal. Because the absence of consultation was not cruelty, but simply the condition of being a child who belonged to people with few resources and many pressures. What she carried from Bernay into the years with her father was not trauma in any dramatic or visible sense. She was not withdrawn, not frightened, not visibly marked. She was, by all accounts, talkative, curious, and already possessed of a performer's instinct for reading a room. But she had learned in those early years a specific thing about how care is distributed in the world, that it tends to come from unexpected sources, that it tends to be contingent, and that the people formally responsible for providing it are often the ones least able to do so. She would spend the rest of her life finding this to be true and organizing her relationships around it in ways she seems never to have examined directly. The people she loved most intensely were almost always people she had located herself, outside the expected channels. Not family, not institutions, not the official structures of the music industry. She found them in cabarets, on street corners, in hotel lobbies, in the specific social zone where formal respectability ran out. She knew how to be at ease there. She had been at ease there since she was 2 years old. In Bernay, the women had set a place for her at the table. She had eaten and been warm and eventually been able to see again. That was the template. Everything else was a variation on it. The street act that Louis Gassion had been running for years before Edith joined it was not a modest operation by the standards of Parisian street performance. He was genuinely skilled, a contortionist and acrobat who had developed a routine capable of drawing substantial crowds in the right locations. The right locations in Louis' circuit meant the open squares and wide pavements of working-class neighborhoods, where people moved slowly enough to stop, and where the density of foot traffic made a gathered crowd visible to other potential watchers from a distance. Performance on the street is partly about the performance itself and partly about the social signal of other people already watching. Louis understood this. He had been doing it for years. Edith's addition to the act changed its character significantly. A child singing repoised and singing in the way she sang without apparent effort, without the performative straining that trained child performers often displayed, produced a different response in passers-by than acrobatics alone. People stopped for the physical spectacle of Louis' work. They stayed for her. Something in the combination of her age and her voice and the complete absence of theatrical presentation created a quality of exposure that was difficult to look away from. She did not perform emotion. She simply had it, and it came out when she sang, and people on the street in Belleville in the early 1920s, living lives of considerable daily pressure, recognized it as something true. They traveled together through the suburbs and outer arrondissements, Ménilmontant, Charonne, the areas east of the city center where the streets narrowed and the buildings pressed close. The itinerary was determined by Louis' knowledge of where the money was, which neighborhoods had enough foot traffic on which days, which markets, and which squares. They carried what they needed. They ate from what they earned. On good days, this was adequate. On bad days, it was not. And Edith would later describe, without particular emphasis, the experience of going to sleep hungry as a routine inconvenience rather than a crisis, which is precisely how it feels when it happens often enough. She was singing standards from the café concert tradition, the songs her mother had known and that had circulated through the street-performing world for decades. Songs by Eugène Potier's generation, drinking songs, sentimental ballads about love and loss and the particular longing of people who worked with their bodies and drank to forget it. She had no sheet music. She had no formal knowledge of what key she sang in or what the chord structure beneath a song required. She had the songs in her memory, absorbed from her mother's occasional presence and from the ambient musical culture of the streets she had grown up on, and she reproduced them with a fidelity that was entirely her own, meaning she changed them without knowing she was changing them, shaping the phrasing around her own breath and her own instinct for where the weight of a line should fall. By the time she was 12 or 13, she was beginning to perform independently of Louis on some days. Taking a corner by herself, building a small crowd, collecting coins and a hat. The separation was gradual and undramatic. He had his circuit, and she was developing her own sense of where she could work effectively. There was no argument about this, no negotiation. It was simply the natural loosening of an arrangement that had always been practical rather than emotional. It was during these solo years that she met Simone Berthaud, Momone, who became her closest companion through the years of street performance. Momone was similarly displaced, living in conditions of comparable instability, working the streets in the same zones, possessed of a quick intelligence and a talent for navigating the social terrain of the neighborhood that complemented Edith's more internally focused quality. They performed together sometimes, Momone singing harmony or simply standing nearby as moral support. More often, they simply moved through the same world together, sharing money when they had it, finding places to sleep, eating when they could. The question of where Edith slept during these years is one that biographers handle with varying degrees of precision. The honest answer is that it varied considerably and was frequently uncertain. She stayed with Louis when his lodgings permitted it. She stayed with Momone. She stayed with various men beginning earlier than the conventional biographical timeline tends to acknowledge, because the social and economic logic of the streets she inhabited made such arrangements both available and, from a purely practical standpoint, rational. She was not, in the understanding of her own world, doing anything remarkable. She was surviving in the ways that survival was available. It was in this period that she developed what would remain a permanent feature of her relationship with money, a complete inability to hold it. She earned on good days and spent immediately. Food, wine, small gifts for whoever was nearby, things that seemed necessary in the moment and that were gone by the following morning. This was not recklessness in any simple sense. It was the financial logic of someone who had learned that money did not accumulate in her world, that it came and went according to forces she could not control, and that the only rational response was to use it when it was present. Hoarding required a faith in continuity that nothing in her experience had justified. She was 15 when she first understood, concretely rather than abstractly, that her voice produced a specific kind of power, not the general power of causing people to stop and listen. She had known that for years. Something more specific, the power to make a particular person feel in the middle of a crowd on an ordinary afternoon that the song was for them alone. She discovered this by watching faces. She watched them the way someone watches a mechanism they are learning to operate, with focused attention and a developing sense of what the variables were. She did not have language for this at 15. She would not develop precise language for it at any point in her life. She spoke about singing in terms of feeling, of giving, of something that happened through her rather than by her. But the watching was real, and what she was learning was real, even if the framework she put around it later was not quite accurate. She was learning on street corners in Belleville how to make a stranger feel known. It was the skill her entire career would rest on. It was also, in ways she could not yet see, the skill that would make her personal life very difficult to navigate. Louis Leplay was 53 years old when he heard Edith Piaf singing on the Rue Troyon in October 1935. He was walking back from an appointment, or possibly from a meal. The accounts differ on the detail, and he stopped, which was not unusual. People stopped for her. What was unusual was what he did next, which was to wait until she had finished, approach her directly, and ask if she would be willing to come and sing at his cabaret on a trial basis, beginning that week. Leplay's establishment, Le Journeys, was on the Rue Pierre Charon in the 8th arrondissement, a different Paris entirely from the streets Edith had been working. The 8th was the Paris of broad boulevards and well-dressed clientele and the particular kind of late-night sociability that required money and a certain ease with spending it. Le Journeys was not the most prestigious venue in the city, but it was legitimate. A real stage, a real piano, a real audience that came specifically to be entertained rather than simply passing by and choosing to stop. Edith hesitated. The account suggests she was genuinely uncertain, which is worth noting because hesitation was not characteristic of her in most situations. She was 20 years old and had been performing on streets for most of her conscious life, and the offer of a proper stage should, by any simple logic, have been an uncomplicated improvement. But she understood without being able to articulate it precisely that the move from the street to the cabaret involved more than a change of venue. On the street, she controlled the terms. She started when she chose, stopped when she chose, sang what she knew, took the money, and left. What Leplay was offering was a different arrangement, and she could sense this even if she could not yet name the specific dimensions of the difference. She said yes. The hesitation lasted only a few minutes. Leplay's first observation, having brought her to the club and heard her perform for him alone in the empty room, was that she needed a name. Edith Piaf was not wrong exactly, but it carried no particular weight. It was simply a name, a family name, belonging to a street acrobat from the suburbs. He wanted something that would create an image before she opened her mouth. He settled on La Môme Piaf, the little sparrow. Piaf was Parisian slang for a small bird, a sparrow specifically, with connotations of thinness and scrappiness and the particular resilience of small things that survive in urban environments. It was accurate in a way that was also strategic. She was small, barely 5 feet tall, thin, with large hands and eyes that took up too much of her face. The name turned these qualities into a coherent image rather than a collection of physical facts. She also needed a dress. She had been performing on the street in whatever she had, which was functional for the street and not functional for a cabaret stage. Leplay chose a simple black dress, short-sleeved, unadorned, cut straight, because he understood that ornamentation would compete with the voice and that the voice needed no competition. The dress became, over time, as much a part of the public construction of Piaf as the name itself. It suggested austerity, mourning, a deliberate refusal of feminine decoration. Whether Edith herself experienced it as any of these things, or simply as a dress that Le Play had chosen, and that seemed to satisfy him, is not recorded. The first performance at Le Journeys, in late October 1935, drew a response that surprised even Le Play, who had been in the entertainment business long enough to have calibrated expectations. The audience, well-dressed, experienced at being entertained, not inclined toward easy sentiment, went quiet in a way that veteran performers know is different from ordinary attention. She sang 5 songs. By the third, several people in the room were visibly moved. By the fifth, the applause was of a kind that Le Journeys had not recently produced. Le Play moved quickly. Within days, he had arranged for her to be heard by journalists, by radio producers, by the specific stratum of Parisian cultural life, and that decided which new voices were worth the city's attention. He brought people to the club. He made calls. He was effective at this. He had been operating in these circles for years, and he knew which relationships to activate and in what order. Within weeks, Edith was being written about in the press. Within months, she had recorded her first songs for Polydor. The recordings, L'étranger and Les Mômes de la Cloche, among the first, are documents of a voice that was already fully formed in its essential qualities. There is no apprentice phase audible in the early recordings. The technique is raw in places, the breath control inconsistent by the standards she would later develop, but the core quality, the directness, the sense of a person genuinely inside the song rather than performing it from outside, is completely present from the beginning. Whatever Le Play had found on the Rue Troyon, it had not needed to be created. It had needed only to be placed somewhere people with resources could hear it. This distinction mattered, though it would take Edith years to fully understand its implications. Le Play had not made her. He had located her and repackaged her and put her in front of the right people. The name was his. The dress was his choice. The venue was his. The connections that produced the recordings and the press attention and the radio appearances were his. She was the instrument. He was operating it. She was grateful to him. The accounts are consistent on this. She spoke of him warmly, visited him regularly, treated the relationship with the kind of loyalty she extended to people who had made her feel that her existence was worth something. He was not exploitative in any simple sense. He appears to have been genuinely invested in her success, and the financial arrangements, while favoring him, were not extraordinary by the standards of the industry at that time. But the structure of the relationship established a pattern that she would encounter repeatedly in the years ahead. A person with access and resources who recognized her value offered to amplify it, and in doing so acquired a significant degree of authority over the form it took. She accepted this the first time because she had no alternative framework. She continued accepting versions of it long after alternatives might have been available. Louis Le Play was found shot dead in his apartment on the Rue de Ponthieu on the morning of April 6, 1936. He had been killed sometime during the night, a single bullet, his body discovered by his housekeeper when he did not appear for breakfast. The apartment showed signs of having been gone through. Drawers opened, items displaced, though whether anything of significant value was taken was not immediately clear. The police arrived, and then the press arrived shortly after, and by the afternoon the story was moving through Paris in the way that stories about violent death in expensive apartments tend to move, quickly, with appetite, and with a great deal of attention to the details that place the victim's life in an interesting light. Le Play was a known figure in a particular stratum of Parisian entertainment. He was also a homosexual man, which in 1936 was not illegal in France, but was socially significant in ways that the press understood how to deploy. His circle of acquaintances included men from backgrounds that the newspapers described with the careful vagueness journalists of that era used to indicate criminal or semi-criminal associations without committing to specifics. The investigation would eventually focus on several individuals from this circle. Arrests were made. A trial followed. The men convicted of the murder, a group including individuals known to police from previous offenses, were sentenced in 1937. Edith was questioned. This was inevitable and not, in itself, evidence of anything beyond the fact that she had been close to the victim and had known people in his social world whom the police wanted to account for. She had known some of the men eventually implicated. Not well, not intimately, but in the way that someone who had grown up in Belleville and moved through the outer edges of Paris's entertainment world would have known people whose lives intersected with criminality without being defined by it. The police questioned her. She answered. She was not charged, the investigation moved in other directions, but the questioning was public. The fact of it was reported, and what the press did with it was not a distortion. Exactly. It was a selection. The story they told was not that Edith Piaf had been questioned and cleared. The story was that the murdered cabaret owner's protégé came from streets where men like his killers were known quantities, that the world which had produced her voice had also produced the people who had ended his life, and that this proximity was itself significant. They printed photographs, the black dress, the large eyes, the small figure that the name La Môme Piaf had been designed to evoke, alongside accounts of the investigation that did not accuse her of anything, while making her presence in the story feel weighted. She gave a press conference. This was almost certainly not her own idea. She had been performing for less than 6 months on a proper stage and had no experience managing public narrative at this scale. Whoever advised her recommended transparency, or at least the appearance of it. She appeared before journalists and spoke about Le Play with genuine emotion. He had been good to her. She had cared for him. His death was a loss she did not have language for. And the emotion was real enough that some of the coverage softened. But softening was not the same as clearing. The story had attached itself to her, and attached stories do not release cleanly. The practical consequence was immediate. The radio appearances that had been scheduled were quietly canceled. Polydor's enthusiasm for a follow-up recording cooled noticeably. The venues that had been considering bookings found reasons to delay. Paris's entertainment establishment, which had been preparing to welcome her 6 months earlier, was now observing a careful distance, not hostile, not explicitly rejecting, but waiting. This was how social exclusion operated in that world, not through direct confrontation, but through the accumulation of unanswered calls and postponed meetings and opportunities that simply did not materialize. She had no money. Le Play had been the source of the income and the connection simultaneously, and both had now been removed. She went back to singing in smaller venues, not quite the street, but not far from it. She was performing in clubs in Pigalle and the surrounding streets, venues that did not require the kind of social endorsement that the cabaret world in the 8th had required. The crowds were smaller and rougher and more immediately responsive in the way that crowds in places with no social pretension tend to be. She was not invisible. She was simply back in a world that had no mechanism for the kind of ascent Le Play had been engineering. It was during this period that Raymond Asso entered her life, though his role would not become fully apparent for several months. He was a lyricist and songwriter with connections to the legitimate music industry, a man of organized habits and definite opinions about what a performer needed to be, and he had seen her perform enough times to have developed a clear sense of both her capacity and what he considered her deficiencies. He was watching from a distance while the scandal settled. He was, in his own telling, waiting for the right moment. This patience was itself a form of calculation that she did not yet have enough information to read accurately. What the Le Play murder did to Edith, in the plainest terms available, was demonstrate that her position in the world she was trying to enter was entirely conditional on the goodwill of specific individuals within it. Le Play had been the mechanism through which she had access. When he was gone, the access went with him. Not because anyone made a decision to exclude her, but because the access had never been hers. It had been borrowed, extended, granted. The black dress and the name and the recordings existed, but the infrastructure that gave them meaning had belonged to someone else. She understood this, though she did not discuss it in those terms. What she discussed? In the interviews she gave during this period. And she continued giving interviews, which required a certain stubbornness in the face of the scandal's residue, was the work, the songs, the next performance. She spoke about Le Play when asked, and she answered questions about the investigation with the patience of someone who had decided that patience was the only tool available. She did not leave Paris. She did not stop performing. She waited, as she had learned to wait on street corners when the foot traffic was slow, for the conditions to shift. Raymond Asso approached her formally in late 1936, after the worst of the Le Play scandal had settled into background noise. He was 32, a former Foreign Legion soldier who had spent time in North Africa before returning to Paris and reinventing himself as a lyricist. He had written songs for Marie Dubus, one of the most respected performers in French popular music, and this credential carried weight in the world Edith was trying to re-enter. He was not a wealthy man or a powerful one in any institutional sense, but he understood the mechanisms of the industry, what the music publishers wanted, what the radio producers responded to, which journalists were worth cultivating and which were not. He presented himself to Edith as someone who could help her navigate these mechanisms more effectively than she had managed alone. The offer was genuine, and she accepted it. What she did not fully account for in accepting it was that Asso's vision of helping her was inseparable from his vision of remaking her. He began with the voice, not the sound of it, which he recognized needed nothing but the technical architecture around it. He arranged for her to study with a vocal coach, to learn breath control in the formal sense, to understand what she was doing instinctively well enough to do it deliberately. She was resistant to this initially. She had been singing since before she could read, and the suggestion that someone with a piano and a set of exercises could teach her something about her own voice was not immediately persuasive. Asso was patient and persistent in equal measure. He explained his reasoning with enough specificity that she could evaluate it rather than simply accept it, which was the right approach for her particular temperament. She began the lessons. He then turned to her speech. Edith spoke with the accent and cadence of Belleville, a working-class Parisian vernacular that was immediately legible to anyone who heard it as a marker of class and neighborhood. In the venues where she was now performing, and in the venues where Asso intended her to perform, this accent functioned as a signal that some audiences would read as authentic and others would read as disqualifying. Asso wanted it softened. He arranged for elocution lessons. He corrected her in private, consistently and without cruelty, but also without apology, when she used constructions he considered incompatible with the image he was building. She complied. This is the part that requires attention, not the fact of the compliance, which had a practical logic, but the texture of it. She was not a passive person. She was not, in any other area of her life during this period, someone who accepted direction without friction. But with Asso she complied, and the compliance was thorough enough to produce results. Within a year, her speech had changed perceptibly. The Belleville edges had not disappeared entirely. They never would, but they had been managed, contained, made available for deployment when they served a purpose rather than simply present as the default. The relationship between them was also romantic, which complicated the professional dimensions in ways that were difficult to separate. They were lovers by early 1937, living together in an apartment that Asso provided. The domestic arrangement meant that his influence was not confined to rehearsal hours or professional meetings. It was continuous, ambient, present at meals and in evenings, and in the ordinary texture of daily life. He had opinions about what she wore, who she spent time with, how she conducted herself in public. These opinions were expressed as guidance, as the considered views of someone with more experience of the world she was entering. They functioned, in practice, as rules. He wrote songs for her specifically. Material that fit not just her voice, but the persona he was constructing around it. Mon Légionnaire, released in 1937, was among the first and most significant of these, a song about a woman's night with a Foreign Legion soldier, written from the woman's perspective, with a directness about desire and loss that was unusual for the period. Asso had drawn on his own Legion experience for the material, but the song existed to serve her, to give her voice a subject matter that matched its emotional register. It worked. The song established her in a way that the earlier Polydor recordings had gestured toward without fully achieving. Radio played it. Critics paid attention. The establishments that had been observing careful distance began tentatively to reconsider. She was performing at Alhambra by 1937 and at ABC, two of the legitimate mid-tier venues in Paris's music hall circuit. These were not the prestigious heights. The Olympia was still some distance away in terms of her standing, but they were real stages with real audiences who had chosen to be there, and the response was consistent enough to establish her as a known quantity rather than a promising newcomer. The scandal had not been erased. It had been layered over, which is a different thing, and the distinction mattered because the layers were not permanent. Asso's control of her public image extended to her personal associations. He was uncomfortable with Momoni's continuing presence in her life. Simone Berthaud, with her street world ease and her cheerful disregard for the boundaries Asso was trying to establish, represented everything he was working to place at a careful distance. He did not forbid the friendship directly. He made his discomfort known and allowed the logic of it to operate. Edith saw Momoni less frequently. The friendship did not end, but it went underground in the way that relationships do when one party is being managed by someone who finds the other party inconvenient. By 1938, she had outgrown the arrangement in a sense that Asso himself may have partially recognized. The persona he had built was functional and effective, but it was also constraining in ways that were becoming visible. She was beginning to have opinions about her repertoire that did not align with his. She was meeting other writers, other composers, other people who had ideas about what her voice could do that differed from Asso's ideas. The lessons had given her enough technical vocabulary to argue about the music on musical terms, which meant that Asso's authority in that domain was no longer simply his by default. The relationship ended in 1940 when she left him for an actor named Paul Maurice. The ending was not quiet. There were scenes, recriminations, the specific bitterness of someone who believed he had built something and was now watching it walk away. He was not wrong about having built something. He was wrong about who it belonged to. Paris fell to German forces in June 1940. The occupation that followed lasted 4 years and imposed on the city a particular kind of daily life that has proven difficult to describe accurately in retrospect. Not because the facts are obscure, but because the moral accounting that came afterward tends to flatten the texture of what ordinary existence under occupation actually required. People went to work. They bought food when food was available. They used the metro. They went to the theater and the cinema and the cabaret, because entertainment did not stop, and the German authorities understood that entertainment that did not stop was a population that did not organize. Edith performed throughout the occupation. This is a fact, and it requires neither minimizing nor amplifying. She performed in venues that German officers attended, in a city where German officers attended nearly everything. She performed for French audiences who needed, with some urgency, to sit in a dark room and hear someone sing about love and loss in their own language. She was not a collaborator in any ideological sense. There is no evidence of political sympathy with the occupying forces, no public statements of alignment, no social relationships with German officials that went beyond the professional unavoidability of performing in occupied Paris. But she performed, and the performances took place in a context that inevitably served the occupiers' interest in maintaining the appearance of a city functioning normally under their administration. The complexity does not resolve cleanly, and this is worth sitting with rather than rushing past. What can be documented more specifically is a series of authorized visits to German prisoner of war camps in Germany, conducted in 1943 under the auspices of the German authorities. These visits were presented publicly as goodwill performances for French prisoners, an opportunity for Edith to sing for men who had been held for years and had little contact with the culture they had left behind. The German authorities approved the visits and organized the logistics. This approval was itself significant, though what it signified was ambiguous. The Germans allowed French cultural figures to visit prisoners when it served propaganda purposes, demonstrating to neutral observers and to the French population that prisoners were being treated with a measure of humanity. During these visits, according to accounts provided after the war by Edith herself and by members of the French resistance network with which she had contact, she participated in a scheme to facilitate prisoner escapes. The scheme involved having group photographs taken of Edith with prisoners during the visits, then having those photographs returned to France, where resistance forgers used them as the basis for identity documents. The prisoners' faces already present in images that could be cropped, reproduced, and embedded in papers that would allow escaped men to move through occupied France. A number of prisoners are said to have used these documents to escape successfully. The evidence for this account is not contemporaneous. It comes primarily from post-war testimony, including Edith's own accounts given in interviews after liberation, when the political and personal value of such a story was considerable. This does not make it false. It makes it unverifiable in the way that wartime resistance activity frequently is, conducted in secrecy, undocumented by design, attested to after the fact by people with reasons both honorable and self-interested, to tell the story in a particular way. What is certain is that she was not subjected to the epuration, the post-war purge of cultural figures deemed to have collaborated with the occupation. Some performers and artists faced tribunals, public humiliation, professional bans. Edith did not. Whether this was because the prisoner escape story was known and credited by the relevant authorities, or because her class background and political irrelevance made her a low priority for investigators focused on more prominent figures, or because the specific texture of her wartime conduct was simply not deemed to require formal accounting, is not entirely clear. The result was the same. She emerged from the occupation with her career intact and her public reputation unexamined in any official sense. The years of the occupation had also produced, in the quiet margins of her professional life, a significant personal relationship. Jean-Louis Joubert of the vocal group Les Compagnons de la Chanson was one of several musicians she had worked closely with during the war years. She had also been with Paul Maurice, the actor she had left Asso for in 1940. A relationship that lasted 2 years and produced at least one account, Maurice's own, given much later, of a domestic life in which Edith's demands on the people around her were considerable and her capacity for directing those demands toward a single individual without respite was striking. Maurice was a disciplined, contained man, and the relationship with Edith appears to have strained that containment significantly. He left, or she ended it, depending on whose account one follows. She had, throughout the war years, continued developing her repertoire and her performing instincts in ways that the chaos of the period paradoxically enabled. The disruption of normal industry structures meant that the gatekeeping mechanisms that Asso had navigated on her behalf were themselves disrupted. She had more direct contact with composers and lyricists, more authority over what she recorded and what she performed, less institutional mediation between her instincts and the material she put on stage. Henri Conté, a lyricist who became a lover in the early 1940s, wrote songs that fit her in a different register than Asso's work had. More interior, more ambiguous in their emotional architecture, less committed to the clean narrative arc of a song like Mon Légionnaire. By the time liberation came in August 1944, she was 30 years old and had been a public figure for nearly a decade. She had survived a murder investigation, a scandal, the reconstruction of her public identity by 2 different men, and 4 years of performing in a city under foreign administration. She had done all of this without a manager in the traditional sense for much of the period. Asso was gone, no permanent replacement had been installed, and she had navigated the industry's reduced wartime structures largely through her own judgment and the informal network of musicians and composers she had built around herself. The liberation brought American soldiers, American music, American energy into Paris in quantities that were immediately intoxicating and immediately complicating for French popular culture. Edith watched this arrival with the attention of someone who understood that the landscape had shifted and that the shifting had implications she needed to calculate. Marcel Cerdan was not a man who moved through the world quietly. He was the middleweight boxing champion of the world, a physical presence of considerable force, and he carried the specific cultural weight that French sporting heroes of that era carried, which was substantial because France in the late 1940s needed its heroes with some urgency. The country was rebuilding. Rationing was still in effect in some areas. The moral accounting of the occupation years was producing a social atmosphere of considerable tension and unresolved guilt. And a boxer from Casablanca who had fought his way to the world title was a particular kind of relief. He was unambiguous. His victories were clean. The scorecard at the end of a fight did not require interpretation. Edith met him in 1947 in New York, where she had gone for the first of what would become a series of extended American engagements. The meeting was not accidental. They had been introduced through mutual connections, and the introduction had been made with some awareness that they might find each other interesting. What neither the mutual connections nor anyone else could have fully anticipated was the velocity of what followed. The relationship developed with an intensity that both of them seemed to have found surprising. Cerdan was not, by the accounts of people who knew him, a man given to dramatic romantic entanglement. He was disciplined, physically oriented, focused on his training and his fights in the way that serious athletes are focused, with a kind of monastic attention to the body's condition that left limited space for emotional complexity. He had a wife, Marinette, and 3 children in Casablanca. His family life was stable and, by all appearances, genuinely valued. He was not looking for what he found with Edith. She was 32 when they met, at the height of her professional powers and in the middle of her first serious engagement with the American market. She had been performing at the Playboy Club in New York, not the venue that name would later suggest, but a legitimate supper club. And the American audiences, who had no prior relationship with her and no French cultural context to bring to the experience, were responding to her in a way that was almost clinical in its purity. They heard a woman singing in a language they did not speak and were moved. This told her something about the nature of what she was doing that even 20 years of French audiences had not fully confirmed. Cerdan began to travel to be with her. This was not a casual logistical decision. He was a professional athlete with a training schedule, a management team, and a championship to defend, and rearranging his movements to accommodate the touring schedule of a French singer required effort and concealment. He came to New York, to Paris when she was there, to wherever she was performing when he could manage it. The relationship was known in the circles they both moved in, but it was not public. Marinette and the children were in Casablanca, and the maintenance of that separation required a continuous collective discretion on the part of the people around them. Edith wrote about Cerdan in letters to friends during this period with an openness that was unusual for her. She was not generally someone who described her emotional states in writing with precision. She processed things through performance, through conversation, through the immediate physical presence of people she trusted. But the letters about Cerdan have a quality of directness that suggests she was experiencing something she felt required documentation. She described him in physical terms: his size, his warmth, the specific weight of his presence in a room, and in terms of what he made possible for her, which was, as she described it, a kind of stillness. He did not need her to be performing. He was not in the room to experience the effect she could produce in an audience. He was simply there, and her simply being there was sufficient. This was not a quality many people in her life had offered her. In October 1949, Cerdan was scheduled to fly from Paris to New York for a rematch with Jake LaMotta, who had taken his title in June of that year. The original plan had been for him to travel by ship, but the rematch date was moved forward and a flight was arranged instead. Edith had asked him to come sooner. This detail, that she had pressed him to fly rather than sail, to arrive earlier than the ship would have allowed, is one she could not afterward discuss without visible distress. It was reported by people who were with her in the years following and is consistent with what is known about her relationship to guilt and causality. She believed that her request had determined the method of his travel. Air France. Flight 009 from Paris to New York went down over the Azores on October 28, 1949. All 48 people aboard were killed. Cerdan was among them. Edith was told the news in New York. She was scheduled to perform that evening at the Versailles Club. The question of whether she performed has sometimes been described in terms that frame it as heroism or as pathology, depending on the disposition of the writer. The plain account is that she went on stage. She sang. The audience did not know what had happened. She finished the performance and went back to her dressing room. In the days that followed, she did not cancel engagements. She performed through the immediate period of grief with a continuity that her colleagues found difficult to witness, and that she herself, in later accounts, was unable to explain satisfactorily. She said she needed to work. She said the stage was where she could put it. These explanations are not false, but they are also not complete. Something in the structure of her life, the way performance had been, since Belleville, the primary mechanism through which experience became bearable, made the stage the only available location for grief of this magnitude. She began consulting a medium. This is documented. She attended seances in the period following Cerdan's death, seeking contact with him through practitioners she found through friends. She reported receiving communications, whether she believed these communications in any literal sense or whether the seances served a different psychological function, providing a structured ritual for grief in the absence of any other available structure, is not determinable from the outside. She attended them repeatedly over a period of months. She dedicated Hymne à l'amour, released in 1950, to Cerdan. The song, which she had written with Marguerite Monod before his death, took on a meaning in its public reception that the circumstances of his death had given it. She sang it for the rest of her life. The first accident happened in 1951. Edith was a passenger in a car driven by the actor Felix Martin, traveling at night on a road outside Paris. The car left the road. The specific cause, speed, poor visibility, driver error, was not definitively established in the accounts that followed. Edith sustained injuries to her arm and her ribs, painful enough to require medical attention and a period of reduced activity, but not severe enough to interrupt her schedule for long. She was performing again within weeks. The incident was reported briefly in the press and did not, at the time, register as anything more than misfortune of the kind that happens to people who travel frequently by road in the early 1950s, which was a statistically meaningful risk. The second accident was more serious. In 1952, she was in another car, again at night, again with injuries to her body that required hospitalization. The details in available accounts are less precise than one would wish. The specific road, the specific circumstances, the specific nature of the injuries. What is consistent across sources is that the second accident compounded damage from the first, that the recovery was longer and more medically managed than the recovery from the initial incident, and that morphine was introduced into this management at some point during this period. The third accident occurred in 1953. She was again a passenger. Again, the injuries were significant. A pattern had now established itself that was visible to everyone around her, though what it meant to each person who observed it varied considerably depending on their relationship to her and their interests in her continued functioning. Her doctors managed pain. Her manager managed schedules. Her friends managed proximity. Each of these people was working with the same basic information, that Edith Piaf was a woman whose body was accumulating damage at a rate that should have produced a recalibration of how she lived. And each of them was finding reasons, good and otherwise, to continue as before. Morphine in 1950s, France was prescribed with a freedom that later decades would consider reckless. The medical understanding of dependency was not what it would become, and the clinical protocols around pain management for a patient with multiple traumatic injuries over a short period did not include the systematic monitoring of intake that would now be standard. She was in pain. The drug addressed the pain. The doctors who prescribed it were not negligent by the standards of their moment, which does not mean the outcome was not foreseeable. It means that the foresight required to anticipate it was not available in the form it would need to take. She was also drinking. The drinking predated the accidents. It had been a feature of her social life since the Belleville years, when alcohol was one of the few available pleasures, and abstinence would have required a deliberate act of self-distinction from the world around her. By the early 1950s, the drinking had a different quality, though describing this quality precisely is difficult, because the people around her had reasons to minimize it in their accounts, and she herself rarely addressed it directly. What can be said is that the combination of alcohol and morphine, administered to a body that was also performing at a level of physical intensity that would have been demanding for a healthy person, was producing a cumulative effect that was visible in her appearance and intermittently in her performances. The performances were not uniformly affected. This is important because it complicates the simple narrative of decline. There were nights throughout this period when she walked on stage in a condition that her colleagues considered alarming and produced performances of devastating quality. The voice did not degrade in the way one might expect, or it degraded only partially, inconsistently, in ways that preserved the essential quality while wearing down the edges. Audiences did not always know what they were witnessing. Sometimes they knew precisely and attended anyway because the witnessing itself had become part of what the performance offered. In 1953, she underwent her first serious attempt at withdrawal. Not a formal rehabilitation program in any modern sense, but a medically supervised reduction in morphine intake that she undertook in a clinic. She stayed for a period, reduced the dosage, returned to performing, and within months was using again. This pattern, withdrawal, return to work, relapse, would repeat itself over the following decade with a regularity that suggests it was not experienced by those around her as a crisis requiring fundamental intervention, but as a management problem requiring periodic adjustment. The people who constituted her professional and personal circle during this period were in a structural position that made fundamental intervention difficult. Her manager, Lulu Barrier, who had become her primary professional handler in the late 1940s, understood that her earning capacity was directly tied to her performing capacity, and that disrupting the performing schedule for any reason, including her health, had immediate financial consequences for everyone in the operation. Her friends and lovers, who overlapped considerably with her professional associates, had emotional investments that made clear-eyed assessment difficult. Confronting her about the dependency meant risking the relationship, and the relationships with Edith, as the people in them were aware, were not easy to replace once lost. She was also not, in any simple sense, a person who could be managed by others against her own inclinations. This had been true since the Belleville years, and had not changed with success or illness. She had spent her adult life navigating situations in which other people tried to determine the terms of her existence, and her response to such attempts had consistently been to work around them rather than confront them directly. To comply in the visible registers while maintaining control in the registers that mattered to her. She was not going to stop taking morphine because someone told her to stop taking morphine. She would stop when she decided to stop, and then she would start again. The physical consequences were accumulating in ways that could be measured. She had lost weight she could not afford to lose. Her hands had developed a tremor that was visible in photographs from this period, if one knows to look for it. The recovery time after each performance was extending. She needed longer rest between shows, more preparation, more management of the body's resources. The arthritis that would later become severe was beginning to make itself felt in her joints. She signed a contract for a major American tour in 1955 and began preparing for it with the same focused energy she brought to every significant professional undertaking. The preparation was thorough. The tour proceeded. The American audiences, who had been following her career since the late 1940s, received her with the sustained enthusiasm of people who had decided she was one of the essential things. New York received Edith Piaf in a way that Paris, for all its familiarity, could not quite replicate. This was partly a function of novelty. She was foreign, singing in a language most of her American audiences did not speak, and the foreignness itself produced a quality of attention that domestic fame tends to gradually erode. Paris knew her. New York was still learning her, and the process of being learned carried an energy that she found sustaining in ways she did not always articulate clearly, but that were visible in her conduct during American engagements. She arrived differently. She moved through the city differently. The specific weight of being Edith Piaf, the accumulated history, the scandal residue, the social complexity of being known in a particular way by a particular culture, was briefly suspended. She had first performed in New York in 1947 at the Playboy Club on 57th Street to initial audiences that were polite and uncertain. The uncertainty did not last. By her second and third engagements, she was performing at the Versailles, a supper club on East 51st Street that drew the specific stratum of New York cultural life: writers, musicians, theater people, the socially ambitious, who would carry impressions from a performance outward into the city's conversation. Virgil Thompson reviewed her. Marlene Dietrich, whom she had known from Paris, was in the audience and became a figure of genuine friendship during the American years. One of the few relationships in Edith's adult life that appears to have operated between two people of comparable force and self-possession, without either one attempting to reconstruct the other. The friendship with Dietrich is worth examining because it was structurally unusual in the context of Edith's relationships. Dietrich was not someone she had discovered, promoted, managed, or rescued. She was not someone who needed Edith's resources or connections. She was a peer, in the specific sense of being a woman who had also built a public identity of considerable power, and who had also paid for it in ways the public did not see. They appear to have recognized something in each other that produced a respect not conditional on the usual dynamics. They socialized. They attended each other's performances. Dietrich was present at Edith's first marriage in 1952 as a witness, a formal role that suggested the friendship had achieved a solidity beyond social convenience. The American engagements multiplied through the early 1950s. She performed at Carnegie Hall in 1956 and again in 1957, concerts that established her in the American cultural memory in a way that supper club performances, however successful, had not quite managed. Carnegie Hall carried a different kind of cultural weight. It said to the American audience and to the press that this was not a curiosity or an exotic entertainment, but a serious artist performing serious work. The reviews from these concerts are among the most sustained and considered pieces of writing about her performances available in English, and they are useful precisely because their writers had no prior relationship with her legend and were responding to the immediate experience of her voice in a large room. What the American years produced, alongside the professional gains, was a form of rootlessness that accumulated slowly enough to be invisible in any given moment. She maintained an apartment in Paris, various apartments sequentially, as her finances and relationships shifted, but she was absent from it for long stretches. The friendships she had in Paris, the informal network of musicians and composers and performers who constituted the texture of her daily life, were interrupted by the Atlantic crossings in ways that each individual interruption seemed temporary, but that cumulatively produced a thinning of connection. She also formed, during the American years, a series of intense attachments to people she encountered in New York and who did not travel back to Paris with her. There were affairs, brief and not so brief, with men whose names appear in memoirs and biographies with varying degrees of documentation. There was a sustained attachment to the French singer Eddie Constantine, who was building his own American career during this period, that those around her considered significant. What is consistent across these American entanglements is their intensity and their brevity. She moved toward people with considerable force, and the force was not always sustainable over the duration it encountered. The French cultural establishment's relationship to her American success was complicated in the specific way that French cultural establishments tend to find American validation of French artists complicated. There was pride. She was demonstrating that French song was not merely a domestic phenomenon, but something that could reach across a cultural and linguistic barrier and produce genuine response. There was also a faint but perceptible irritation at the suggestion that Carnegie Hall had confirmed something that the Olympia had been confirming for years. She was aware of this and found it mildly amusing, which was perhaps the appropriate response. Her finances during this period were chaotic in a way that her earning capacity should have made unnecessary. She was among the highest-paid performers in France, and during the American years, commanding fees that placed her in the upper range of international concert performers. The money came in and went out with approximately equal velocity. She supported people, younger performers she had taken up, former lovers who had fallen on difficulty, friends whose situations required assistance, strangers whose circumstances she encountered and found unacceptable. She paid for things without tracking what she had paid for. She signed contracts without reading them carefully, or at all, relying on advisors whose reliability she had not always rigorously established. Lulu Barrière managed the professional schedule with competence. The financial management was less coherent. There were periods when she was technically insolvent despite having performed, in the preceding months, at venues that should have produced substantial income. The money had moved in directions that were difficult to reconstruct after the fact. The tax authorities took an interest in her situation more than once. The interest was managed each time through the earnings of the next engagement, which is a financial structure that requires the engagements to continue indefinitely at current or increasing levels. By the late 1950s, she had been crossing the Atlantic regularly for more than a decade. She was 43 years old. The body was carrying the accumulated weight of the accidents, the dependency, the performing schedule, the financial stress, and the specific toll of years spent living in hotels and dressing rooms and other people's apartments. Paris was where she returned. It was not, in any straightforward sense, where she lived. Jacques Pils was a known quantity in French popular music by the time he and Edith became serious in 1952. He had been performing since the 1930s, had spent time in the United States during the war years, and had built a career of respectable solidity. Not a phenomenon, not a star of the first order, but a working professional with a name the industry recognized and an ease in front of audiences that came from decades of practice. He was handsome in a conventional way, agreeable in his manner, and possessed of the specific social intelligence that allows a person to function smoothly in environments where many different kinds of people need to be managed simultaneously. He was, in other words, a man well suited to the practical demands of being with Edith Piaf. They married in New York on July 29, 1952. Marlene Dietrich was the witness, standing at the ceremony with the composed attention of someone who understood the occasion's significance without needing to perform that understanding. The wedding was covered by the press on both sides of the Atlantic. Not extensively, but enough to establish the fact of it as a public record. Photographs from the ceremony show Edith in a gray suit, her expression difficult to read with confidence, which was not unusual for her in formal situations where the expected emotional register was one she found constraining. The marriage produced in its first year something that resembled stability. Pils was organized where she was not. He kept track of appointments, managed the domestic logistics of their shared life with a competence that she had not previously had consistent access to, and provided a kind of daily continuity that the preceding years, with their losses and their chemical disruptions and their Atlantic crossings, had not contained. She appeared in the accounts of people who knew her during this period somewhat settled. The word used is relative. Settled for Edith Piaf was a condition that would have appeared hectic to most people. But the comparison was to the years immediately before, and by that comparison, it was real. Pils also attempted to address the morphine dependency in a way that the people around her had generally avoided attempting directly. He was not naive about what he had married into. Well, the dependency was not a secret within her circle, and anyone who had spent time with her in recent years had seen enough to form an accurate picture. His approach was practical rather than confrontational. He worked with her doctors, monitored her intake where he could, attempted to establish conditions in their shared life that made the drug less necessary, without insisting on abstinence in a way that would have produced immediate resistance. This was a reasonable strategy. It produced partial results. The dependency did not end. It was, for a period, somewhat contained. He was also managing his own career during these years, which meant that they were frequently apart. Different engagements in different cities, the ordinary professional fragmentation of two performers whose schedules were determined by separate sets of bookings and obligations. The separations were not contentious. They were simply the condition of the life they had each chosen before they chose each other, and neither had any realistic expectation that marriage would change the fundamental structure of a performing career. But the separations meant that the stabilizing function Pils served in their shared domestic life was intermittently unavailable, and during his absences, the conditions that stability had temporarily modified tended to reassert themselves. Edith was recording prolifically through the mid-1950s. La Vie en Rose, which had been recorded earlier, was now thoroughly embedded in the international imagination. It was the song that preceded her wherever she went, the thing people knew before they knew anything else. She had complicated feelings about this, which she expressed obliquely in interviews by deflecting questions about it toward other songs she considered more fully representative of what she could do. La Goélante du Pauvre Jean from 1954 was a song she spoke about with more evident investment, a harder song, less immediately melodic, requiring more from a listener. She was aware that the public's love for La Vie en Rose was in some tension with her own sense of what her best work was. The professional confidence of this period coexisted with a domestic life that was beginning to show, beneath its managed surface, the pressures that the surface had been managing. Pils was patient. He was also a man with his own needs and his own sense of what a life should contain, and the life he had entered was consuming in ways that patience alone could not indefinitely accommodate. The people around Edith, her musicians, her assistants, Momoni when she appeared, the rotating cast of younger performers she was perpetually discovering and promoting, constituted a world that had its own logic and its own demands, and navigating that world while maintaining a coherent identity within it was not straightforward. There were also the financial pressures, which Pils was more aware of than she was, because he was more inclined to look at figures. What he found, when he looked, was not reassuring. The income was substantial, and the outgoing was more substantial. The support she extended to people around her, the loans that were not repaid, the expenses she absorbed without accounting for them, the professional investments she made in younger performers whose careers she was funding, represented a consistent hemorrhage that the earning capacity was struggling to match. He raised this. She heard it. The pattern continued. By 1956, the marriage was functionally ending, though it did not officially conclude until their divorce in 1957. The ending was not dramatic in the way that endings in Edith's life sometimes were. There was no single moment, no rupture, no scene that served as the definitive point. It was rather an accumulation of small withdrawals on both sides, a gradual reduction in the shared surface area of their lives, until what remained was too thin to be called a marriage without the word becoming misleading. Pills gave interviews after the divorce that were carefully worded. He said nothing directly negative and nothing that could be credibly disputed, which in the circumstances was probably the most generous available approach. He had been, for 5 years, the most practically functional partner she had ever had. He had organized things, managed things, attempted to address the dependency, provided daily continuity. When it ended, she was in approximately the same condition as when it had begun, which was both a testament to how much he had managed and a measure of what management alone could not reach. The pattern had been visible for years before anyone named it directly. Edith would encounter a young man, a singer usually, occasionally an actor or a musician, whose talent she found compelling and whose circumstances she found insufficient. She would take him up, she would arrange introductions, fund recordings, place him in front of the right people, write or commission songs that suited his particular qualities. She would also, in most cases, become romantically involved with him, which meant that the professional investment and the emotional investment were conducted simultaneously and through the same set of interactions. The relationship would intensify, producing in the young man a combination of genuine gratitude, professional advancement, and an increasing awareness that the conditions of the arrangement were more complex than they had initially appeared. Eventually, by a variety of routes, it would end. She had been on the receiving end of this structure twice, with LaPlay, who had located and repackaged her, and with Asso, who had reconstructed her from the outside in. She had observed it operate on her with enough clarity to describe it, in interviews, in terms that acknowledged both what it had given her and what it had cost. What she does not appear to have recognized, or does not appear to have recognized fully, was that she had reproduced it, that the structure she had been subject to was now the structure she was operating from the other side with younger people who were in approximately the position she had occupied at 20. Georges Moustaki arrived in her life in 1958. He was 23 years old, Greek-Egyptian by background, possessed of a genuine songwriting talent that was still largely undeveloped in the formal sense. He had come to Paris from Alexandria as a teenager and had been moving through the edges of the music world, playing guitar in small venues, writing songs that no one had yet recorded. She met him through musicians she knew, heard him play, and made a decision with the speed that characterized her decisions about people she found interesting. Within months, Moustaki was living with her, writing songs for her and being introduced to the industry connections that could turn a talented unknown into a working professional. She recorded Milord in 1959, a song Moustaki wrote with Marguerite Monod, and the recording became one of the defining moments of her late career. A song with a narrative directness and a melodic confidence that demonstrated to anyone who needed the demonstration that she had lost nothing essential in the preceding decade of physical difficulty. Milord was not a song that could be performed by someone whose instrument was diminished. It was performed by someone in full possession of what she had. The car accident that interrupted the relationship came in 1958 during the period of their involvement. Moustaki was driving when the car crashed and both were injured. The accident's occurrence within this specific relationship had a particular resonance given the history of earlier accidents, though no one in her circle appears to have treated this resonance as actionable information. She recovered. He recovered. The relationship continued for a period before ending in the way these relationships ended. The young man moving toward a life that had its own shape, the professional advancement she had provided now sufficient to give him independent standing. Claude Figus, Félix Martin, Georges Moustaki, the names accumulate across the late 1950s with a regularity that her biographers have noted and that the people around her at the time noted as well. The emotional investment she made in each relationship was not performed. The grief when each ended was genuine. But the structure repeated with enough consistency to suggest that it was not simply a series of individual choices, but something more systematic, a way of organizing intimacy that had calcified around a particular template, one that required the other person to be, at least initially, in a position of needing what she could provide. What this template could not accommodate was equality of standing. When Moustaki, after Milord, became a figure of his own significance in French popular music, writing for other artists, performing his own material, acquiring the kind of professional identity that does not require anyone else's apparatus. The dynamic that had organized their relationship was no longer available. He did not need her professional resources. What remained was personal, and personal, without the professional structure around it, was apparently not sufficient to hold. The physical deterioration that had been accumulating through the 1950s became more visible in the early 1960s. She had developed rheumatoid arthritis, which affected her hands and her movement with increasing severity. She was also dealing with the hepatic damage that years of alcohol use had produced. 2 bouts of what was reported as a coma in 1959, the second serious enough to produce public reports that she might not survive. She survived. She lost weight she could not afford to lose. Photographs from 1960 show a woman who looks considerably older than 45, the face drawn in ways that the photographs from the early 1950s do not anticipate. The Olympia concert in December 1960 was organized partly as a rescue operation for the Olympia itself, which was in financial difficulty and needed a guaranteed draw, and partly as a demonstration that she was still performing at the level her reputation required. Bruno Coquatrix, the Olympia's director, was a man she had a genuine professional relationship with, and the arrangement was mutually understood. She needed to demonstrate her continuing viability, and he needed the revenue her name would generate. She rehearsed with a physical difficulty that the people present at rehearsals found distressing. She walked on stage on opening night in December 1960 in conditions that her doctors had advised against. The audience received her with the specific quality of ovation that contains relief, the sound of people who had been uncertain about what they were going to witness and had found something that exceeded what they had feared to expect. She performed the full concert. She performed it, by the accounts available, at a level that was not diminished sentiment, but actual quality. The voice reaching the places in the repertoire that required it to reach, the physical limitation invisible from the auditorium in the way that skilled performers can make physical limitation invisible when the instrument beneath the limitation is sufficiently powerful. Theo Sarapo was in the world she moved in by this point, moving toward the center of it. Charles Dumont brought the song to her in 1960. He had written it with Michel Vauquer, and he played it for her at her apartment on the Boulevard Lannes, sitting at her piano expecting her to decline it the way she had declined several of his previous compositions. She had been dismissive of his work before, not cruelly, but with the directness she applied to everything she found insufficient. He had persisted because persistence was what the situation required, and because he believed, with the particular conviction of a songwriter who knows when he has written something real, that this song was suited to her in a way that his earlier material had not been. She listened to it once, then she asked him to play it again, then again. By the accounts of people present in the apartment that afternoon, Dumont himself, and at least one other person whose recollection corroborates his, she was crying before the second playing was finished, not performing emotion for the people in the room, but actually crying, which was a distinction those who knew her could make reliably. She said when she could speak clearly that it was her song, that it said what she needed to say. Non, je ne regrette rien. I regret nothing was recorded in November 1960 and released shortly after. The timing placed it in direct proximity to the Olympia concerts of December 1960, which meant that the recording and the live performance reinforced each other in the public consciousness with an intensity that neither would have achieved alone. People heard the record and then came to the Olympia to hear it live, or heard it live and then went back to the record to recover something of what the live performance had produced. The song became, within months of its release, the thing most people thought of when they thought of Edith Piaf. This created a problem that she did not fully resolve in the time remaining to her. The song is, in its lyrical content, a statement of absolute acceptance. Nothing regretted, nothing retained from the past, everything paid for and set aside in favor of the present moment and whatever follows it. It was received almost immediately as an autobiographical declaration. The public heard Edith Piaf singing Non, je ne regrette rien, and understood it as Edith Piaf's personal statement about Edith Piaf's life. The deaths, the accidents, the dependency, the failed relationships, the years of difficulty, all of it, the song seemed to say, was accepted, processed, transcended. She had not written the words. She had not written the music. She had recognized the song as hers, which is a different kind of authorship, but one that the public reception collapsed into simple autobiography. She became the song in the public imagination in a way that made any more complicated account of her interior life difficult to sustain. The woman who consulted mediums to speak with Marcel Cerdan, who wept in rehearsals, who could not hold money or relationships with any consistency, who was currently dependent on morphine and arthritic and losing weight at a rate her doctors found alarming. That woman was harder to see once Non, je ne regrette rien had established its alternative image so completely. She performed it at the Olympia on December 29, 1960. The concert had already been running for weeks, each night to a full house, each night producing the quality of ovation that had characterized opening night. This particular evening has been documented in some detail. The reviews, the audience accounts, the photographs taken from the wings. She walked on stage with the careful deliberateness of someone managing pain that the audience would not be permitted to see. She was wearing the black dress. She had lost so much weight that the dress required alteration. When she sang Non, je ne regrette rien, the audience's response was of a kind that those present subsequently struggled to describe without resorting to language they admitted was inadequate. It was not simply enthusiasm. It was the specific response that happens when a very large number of people simultaneously recognize something as true. True in the way that art is occasionally true, which is different from factual accuracy and more difficult to dispute. The standing ovation lasted long enough to become uncomfortable for the people on stage who had to stand in it. She took the applause with her eyes open, looking at the audience directly, which was her habit. She did not perform gratitude or humility. She received the response with the stillness of someone who had been receiving versions of it for 25 years, and had learned that the only honest response was to be present for it without pretending that it was something other than what it was. What it was, and what no one in the auditorium was required to confront, was a woman in serious physical decline, delivering a performance that the circumstances of her delivery directly contradicted. The regret that the song denied was present in her body in ways the song could not address. In the arthritic hands gripping the microphone stand, in the weight that the dress was designed to conceal, in the medical reality that her doctors had been attempting to communicate to her management for months. The song said nothing was retained from the past. The past was in every joint and every organ. She gave interviews during this period in which she spoke about the song with a thoughtfulness that the public reception did not always allow for. She said that singing it was not the same as living it. She said that the song was something she reached for, not something she had arrived at. These distinctions were noted by the journalists who recorded them, and then largely set aside in the published accounts, because the distinction between reaching for something and possessing it was less useful to a profile than the simpler narrative the song provided. The Foreign Legion adopted Non, je ne regrette rien as an unofficial anthem at some point in the early 1960s, used, according to various accounts, when legionnaires completed their basic training. A moment of collective completion and forward movement. This adoption, which she is said to have found both flattering and somewhat bewildering, added another layer of meaning to the song that had nothing to do with her or her life. The song was now also about soldiers finishing their formation and moving on. It had begun to belong to people who had never heard of Marcel Cerdan. She continued recording through 1962. The sessions were difficult. Her voice required more preparation than it once had. Her stamina in the studio was diminished. The sessions ran longer as takes were needed that earlier in her career would have been unnecessary. But the recordings from this final period are not documents of a failing instrument. They are documents of an instrument being used with a precision that compensates for what physical condition has reduced. Theo Sarapo was born Theophanis Lamboukas in Paris in 1936, the son of Greek immigrant parents who ran a hairdressing salon in the 14th arrondissement. He had grown up in a working-class household not entirely unlike the environments Edith had moved through as a child, which may have been part of what she recognized in him when they met. though she did not articulate it in those terms. He was tall, dark-featured, possessed of a physical presence that was striking in a conventional way, and he wanted to sing. He had a voice, not a voice of the order she had encountered in Marcel Cerdain or had herself possessed at 20, but a workable instrument with genuine qualities that training and the right material could develop. She met him in 1961, introduced through the hair salon connection. He had been doing work in the entertainment world's peripheral zones, the kind of ambient proximity to the industry that people with performing ambitions and no established route in tend to occupy for years before finding a door. She was 45, he was 26. The 19-year difference was noted immediately and continuously by the press, which found in the gap a ready-made narrative that required no additional construction. The narrative was an aging woman in decline, attaching herself to a young man who had reasons other than love to accept the attachment. The narrative was not entirely wrong. It was also not entirely right. The people who were present in their daily life during 1961 and 1962, her musicians, her assistants, the small circle of people who constituted the operational reality of her existence, gave accounts that were more complicated than the press version. Serapo was not performing affection he did not feel. He was, by these accounts, genuinely attentive, present in ways that went beyond what professional calculation would have required, engaged with her daily well-being with a patience that the circumstances made demanding. He drove her to medical appointments. He sat with her during the periods of illness that were becoming more frequent and more serious. He learned her routines and her requirements, and managed them without the resentment that managing someone in her condition, with her temperament, would have been understandable in producing. Whether this constituted love in the fullest sense of the word is not determinable from the outside, and the question itself may be less interesting than the fact of the conduct. He was there. He was consistently there in the specific way that matters when a person's body is failing and the world around them is gradually rearranging itself around the fact of that failure. They married on October 9th, 1962, at the town hall of the 16th arrondissement. The ceremony was civil. The church's position on her marital history made a religious ceremony complicated, a complication that would resurface more severely after her death. The press coverage was extensive and predominantly hostile. The headlines described the marriage in terms that ranged from skeptical to openly contemptuous. Several publications ran photographs in which the age difference was visually emphasized. Serapo, upright and dark-haired, Edith beside him visibly diminished, her face hollowed in ways the camera did not soften. The photographs were accurate. The captions that surrounded them were interpretations dressed as descriptions. She recorded "À quoi ça sert l'amour" as a duet with Serapo in 1962, a song in dialogue form, structured as an argument about whether love is worth its cost, the two voices answering each other across the question. The recording is a document of something specific, a young voice, uncertain and earnest in its qualities, in direct exchange with a voice that had been carrying the weight of the question for 40 years. The song was written for them, which meant it was written around the visible facts of their situation, the age, the difference in standing, the improbability. And it turned those facts into musical material without disguising them. She performed it live at the Olympia in early 1963 in what would be her final engagement there. The concert series had been scheduled and then postponed and then rescheduled as her health fluctuated through the preceding months. She was able to complete the run, which required a physical effort that those around her understood and that the audiences, sitting in the dark of the auditorium, largely did not. Serapo performed with her on some nights, not in a supporting role exactly, but in the specific role the duet required, which was to be present alongside her, rather than subordinate to her. The liver disease that had been developing for years was now the dominant medical fact of her existence. The hepatic damage from the alcohol had been compounded by the medications and the physical stress of decades of performing, and by 1963, her doctors were managing a situation that had moved beyond the reach of management in any meaningful sense. She had periods of relative clarity and periods of extreme debility. She continued, in the periods of clarity, to work, to listen to songs that were brought to her, to record when her voice was available, to plan performances that her body's condition made increasingly theoretical. She was brought from Paris to a rented villa in Plascassier, near Grasse, in the south of France, in the summer of 1963. The move was medical. The climate was considered beneficial. The distance from Paris's professional demands was considered necessary. Serapo was with her. A small domestic staff managed the daily functioning of the household. The villa was comfortable, situated among the hills of Provence in surroundings that were, by any measure, beautiful, and that had no particular relationship to any world she had inhabited before. She died there on October 10, 1963. She was 47 years old. The official cause of death was internal hemorrhaging from liver failure. Serapo was present. The decision that followed, to bring her body back to Paris so that she could be said to have died there, was made by the people managing her affairs and was not in itself unusual for the era or the circumstances. The practicalities of public grief require certain fictions, but the fiction in this case was specific. Paris needed to have been the place, because Edith Piaf could not have died in a rented villa in Provence. The myth required a particular geography, and the geography was adjusted accordingly. Her death certificate records Paris. She died in Grasse. Serapo drove the body back through the night. The Catholic Church refused her a funeral mass. The refusal came from the Archbishop of Paris, Cardinal Felton, on the grounds that her life had not conformed to the Church's requirements for the sacrament, specifically her multiple marriages and her public conduct over the preceding decades. This was not a surprising position given the facts, but its public expression in the immediate aftermath of her death produced a response in Paris that the Church had perhaps not fully anticipated. The refusal was reported in the newspapers with a tone that suggested the institution had miscalculated something about the public's relationship to Edith Piaf, and what it had miscalculated was the degree to which her life's irregularities were not a strike against her in the popular imagination, but a component of what the popular imagination valued about her. The funeral cortege on October 14, 1963, drew an estimated 40,000 people into the streets around Père-Lachaise Cemetery. The number has been cited variously across sources. Some accounts say more, some say fewer, but the scale is consistent. It was one of the largest public gatherings Paris had seen for a private individual's funeral in the post-war period. People lined the route hours before the cortege passed. They stood in silence along the Boulevard de Ménilmontant, which runs through the neighborhood where she had been born and where she had sung on street corners as a child, and watched the car carry her past. There is something specific about that route worth noting. The Boulevard de Ménilmontant connects Belleville to the cemetery's main entrance. The people who lined it were, in considerable numbers, from the neighborhood, working-class Parisians who had no connection to the cabaret world or the American tours or the Carnegie Hall concerts, but who had grown up hearing her voice on the radio, in cafes, from open windows on summer evenings. Their presence on the street was not a cultural statement or a media event. It was simply people coming out to watch someone from their world pass by for the last time. The grave at Père-Lachaise, Division 97, became, in the months and years following her burial, one of the most visited sites in the cemetery. Père-Lachaise is not short of famous graves. Chopin is there, Oscar Wilde, Molière, a concentration of the culturally significant dead that makes the cemetery itself a kind of compressed cultural history. Within this context, Edith's grave attracted a volume of visitors that placed it consistently among the 3 or 4 most sought-out locations in the cemetery. People left flowers, notes, photographs, small objects. The accumulation of offerings that marks a grave where the living feel they have unfinished business with the dead. What they came to see, strictly speaking, was a black granite slab with her name and dates. The grave is not elaborate. There is no monument, no sculpture, no architectural statement. The simplicity was not a deliberate aesthetic choice so much as a reflection of the financial condition of her estate at the time of her death, which was not the condition one might have anticipated for the highest-paid female performer in France. She died with debts. The estate that Serapo inherited, he survived her by 6 years, dying in a car accident in 1970, was encumbered to a degree that required years to resolve. The financial reality of her death sat in direct contrast to the scale of what she had earned across her career. The calculations that various biographers have attempted suggest that she earned, in total, sums that should have produced substantial residual wealth. The money had moved through her life with the velocity she had learned on Belleville Street corners, acquired and dispersed, never accumulated, never consolidated into the kind of asset base that produces security beyond the next engagement. The younger performers she had supported, the loans she had extended, the expenses she had absorbed, the taxes she had deferred, the advisors whose interests had not been identical to hers, all of it had reduced a fortune to a deficit. The myth that settled over her life in the years following her death was constructed, as myths tend to be, through a process of selection. Certain elements were retained: the street origins, the great love of Sir Don, the voice, the black dress. Non, je ne regrette rien. Other elements were less convenient for the myth and tended to be mentioned briefly and moved past: the daughter who died at 2, the morphine, the seances, the financial chaos, the men she had damaged in the course of the relationship she organized around her own needs. The myth required a coherent shape, and a coherent shape requires the exclusion of whatever resists coherence. The biographical industry that developed around her, the books, the films, the stage productions, the museum in the Rue Crespin du Gast, eventually the 2007 film with Marion Cotillard that introduced her to a generation with no prior relationship to her work. Each iteration made its own selections. Some were more honest than others about what was being selected and what was being set aside. All of them produced a version that was more narratively satisfying than the actual record, which is messier and less directed and contains more damage than any coherent story can comfortably hold. Sarapo continued performing after her death, recording songs she had given him and working in the venues her name had opened to him. He spoke about her in interviews with a reticence that was noted by journalists as unusual. He deflected the questions that sought dramatic accounts of their life together and offered instead descriptions of ordinary days, domestic details, the texture of her presence in a room. Whether this reticence came from protectiveness or grief or a private knowledge of the distance between the public version and the actual version is not something the interviews resolve. He was killed in a car accident near Limoges in August 1970. He was 34 years old. The accident received some press coverage and then was absorbed into the footnotes of her biography, where he appears primarily in relation to her, rather than as a person whose death had its own weight. The grave at Père Lachaise continued to receive its visitors. The flowers were replaced as they wilted. The notes accumulated. People came from considerable distances to stand for a moment at the black granite slab, and then moved on through the cemetery toward whatever else they had come to find. What they were looking for, standing there, is not recorded. The recordings still exist. This is the most straightforward thing that can be said about what remains of Edith Piaf. The voice is there in the grooves of the original pressings and in the digital files that now carry it, unchanged by the decades in the way that the body it came from was changed by them. You can hear in the 1936 recordings the same essential quality that is present in the 1962 recordings: the directness, the absence of self-protection, the sound of someone genuinely inside the material rather than presenting it from a careful distance. Whatever the accidents and the morphine and the liver disease did to the instrument, they did not reach the quality that made the instrument worth hearing. This is either a remarkable fact about the human voice or a remarkable fact about her specifically. It is not clear which. What is less clear is what the life behind the voice actually cost, and who paid what portion of it. She paid, that much is plain. But the people she moved through, the young men she took up and restructured and eventually released into careers she had made possible, the daughter who died at 2 while she was working, the men who loved her and found the loving unsustainable, Sarapo driving through the night with her body. They paid portions as well, and the accounting of those portions is not part of the story that gets told at Père Lachaise. The myth requires a single figure at the center. The actual record contains many people, most of them not famous, all of them affected by the proximity. She said in one of the last interviews she gave that she had no regrets, The journalist wrote it down. The sentence became part of the public record of who she was, whether it was true in any private sense, whether in the villa in Place Cassier in the last weeks, with Serapeau nearby and the hills of Provence outside the window, and the body finally stopping, whether the absence of regret held there, in that specific silence, is not something the recordings can answer. The flowers at the grave are replaced when they wilt. Someone tends to this. Whoever it is does it without being seen.